So I'll just highlight four things in the book. I think the high point of certainly my time, my 6.5 years as Director of National Intelligence, was the takedown of UBL. Very dramatic event. Classic textbook example of the partnership between intelligence and operations. And, spent the 13 hours in the White House Situation Room that day. And I'll never forget, about 11 o'clock that Sunday night, May 2nd, 2011. And it was time for the president to address the country, and a few of us walked over to the East Room to watch him give this address. And I'll never forget walking out the door of the West Wing and the portico there along the Rose Garden. It's the first time I'd, had any fresh air all that day. And of course, the word had gotten out, and there was a crowd in Lafayette Park across from the White House chanting, USA, USA, USA. And of course, we haven't been that united since, 9/11, I guess. But boy, it really hit me emotionally then what we had accomplished, even though it took 10 years to track down UBL. So that was a high water mark for intelligence institutionally, and for those of us in the intelligence community, like Rob, who remembered certainly very indelibly what happened on 9/11, and it was closure for me personally. So that was clearly the high water mark. The low water mark, in contrast, was the aftermath of Edward Snowden and the damage that he did by what he gave away. I've often said, I occasionally get questions, shouldn't Edward Snowden be considered a hero? And I say, no. And here's why. If what he had exposed only related to so-called domestic surveillance, I could almost understand what he did. But the problem is he exposed and compromised so much else that seriously damaged our foreign intelligence capabilities. It had nothing to do with domestic surveillance. And so if you're a taxpayer, any of you are a taxpayer in this room, you are still paying to repair the damage that Edward Snowden did. So that was a low water mark. I think the most interesting experience I had was my trip to North Korea in November in 2014 to pull out, to retrieve two of our citizens who had been incarcerated under hard labor conditions. And it was an amazing experience. Everything you've ever read about what a bizarre place North Korea is, it's all true. It is a bizarre place. And it certainly changed my impression of the North Koreans. And I'll simply say, we can talk about this during the Q&A if you want to, but I'll simply say my big takeaway from my visit to North Korea and interacting with two Korean 4-stars, that there's no way they're going to denuclearize. They are not going to do that. And there's, from their standpoint, good reason. So the most disturbing thing that happened during my time as DNI, in fact, looking back over my 50 plus years in intelligence, the most disturbing thing I think that I experienced was the Russian interference in our election in 2016. All revelation doesn't occur in one day. So it took a period of months to understand, to grasp what the Russians really did to us in 2016. Now, the Russians have a long history of interfering in people's elections, theirs and other people. And we have records going back to the Cold War about the Russians trying to influence the outcome of our elections. But it was always ham-handed and pretty obvious. Well, in 2016, they mounted a very pervasive and sophisticated and in-depth and aggressive campaign against us to influence the outcome of our election. Their first objective was to sow doubt, discord, and distrust in this country, and they succeeded to a fairly well. They had messages mainly in using the technology of the social media on the internet. They had messages for everybody: Black Lives Matter, white supremacists, pro-Nazi, anti-Nazi, pro-Zion, anti-Zion, didn't matter. And they didn't care. All they wanted to do was to exploit the divisiveness and polarization in this country. And unfortunately, we're an easy target. and they succeeded. And they'll continue to do that because that's one of the ways they compensate for their weaknesses. So let me shift then to, speaking of Russia, some brief commentary about what I consider to be 10 major challenges and threats to our country. And I'll start with Russia. These 10 threats I group into three main groups. Nation states, what we call transnational issues, which means those things that transcend national borders, nation state borders. And something I didn't focus on at all when I was DNI. So just to illustrate how fast things change, is our domestic threats that we have, which were not on my radar scope at all as DNI. So the aforementioned Russia. Russia basically is in decline. If it weren't for one thing, we wouldn't pay a whole lot of attention to Russia. Well, the one thing is their nuclear arsenal. They are the major mortal enemy of the United States. They could render great damage and destruction and kill a lot of people in the United States if they so chose. So for that reason only, we need to pay attention to Russia. Russia has the worst mortality rate for males of any industrialized country in the world. All kinds of public health issues, drugs, alcohol, etc., climate and environmental issues. So things are bad in Russia, but we have to pay attention to them because of the nuclear capability. China, everybody thinks, well, that's the big threat. And to a certain extent, it is. But China is not 10 feet tall. Yes, their economy is going to overtake ours as the largest economy in the world. They have underway a very scary and impressive military modernization program, which is specifically and directly keyed to what they consider our strengths, our command and control and intelligence, our forward bases in the Pacific, our ships, notably our carriers. And they design specific weapon systems against what they consider to be our strengths. And they've been pretty successful at it. But a couple things I would point out to you that I think are downers for China. One is, and I'm sensitive about this, they have a large and growing cohort of older people who are considered in economic terms not productive. Now, I'm sensitive about that because I'm older people. And China disproportionately, in comparison to lots of other countries, even Japan, has an increasingly larger cohort of older people who don't work, who demand services from the government. And the burden for providing those services is proportionately falling on a smaller population of productive young people. The other thing is, President Xi has imposed unprecedented, and that's saying something for China, oppression of the people in China. And I would argue that they can't put the genie back in the bottle. And one of the things that my observation has been through many jobs in intelligence, that one of the things that the main thing that impels behavior of the Chinese leadership using the Chinese Communist Party as its instrument of control is to control that big population of 1.3 billion people. They worry about that more than anything else, is controlling that population. And much of what they do externally in a foreign context is really driven by playing to the folks at home. North Korea, I already said my spiel about that. They are not going to denuclearize, and the reason they won't is because that is their ticket to survival. They understand their weaknesses, and they understand that nobody paid any attention to them if it weren't for the perception of nuclear weapons. I say the perception because really neither the North Koreans nor we know if any of these weapons will actually work. But it doesn't matter because they've achieved what they want, which is deterrence. And when I went there, they reminded me about the likes of Muammar Gaddafi, of Libya. Well, he negotiated away his weapons of mass destruction, and things didn't turn out so well for him. And lastly is Iran, another problem child. Those are what I call the four hardy perennials: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And I think I was, during my time in the Obama administration, I supported the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as it's called formally, or the nuclear deal. But I think now, with President Trump having backed out of it, too much water has gone under the bridge, and we can't go back and recapture that agreement. And if there's going to be any agreement, they're going to have to, I think, start over. Because the Iranians have gone way beyond what I think is something they could draw back. They're now producing 20% of highly enriched uranium, and it's a very quick step to get to 90% plus, which is what you need for a nuclear weapon. So the time we had banked on of a year to develop a nuclear weapon is now shrunk to about a month. So that agreement, I think, needs to start over. Okay, so that's the first group of threats. The second group is what I'll call transnational threats. And at risk of offending people, I'll just say that the science tells you that climate change is a huge threat to this planet and a huge threat to mankind. And if we don't do something about it pretty quick, I say we collectively, we're going to be in a world of hurts. I'll just ask you to consider, with the projected growth of the population on this earth, in the face of the fact that arable soil around the earth is declining. We are not generating sufficient arable soil to grow enough food to feed the world, the projected world's population. Think about that. And you don't have to be a scientist to observe the melting of the glaciers in places like Greenland or the North Pole or South Pole, and the impact that has on sea level, where 60 of the major population centers in the earth are in coastal areas. So a rise of 1 or 2 inches in sea level could be devastating. Related to that, and I certainly don't need to dwell on this subject, is disease. And there is a relationship between climate change and the proliferation of disease. The other two, of course, one many of you are working on, which is cyber and space. Cyber, now the last two I distinguish because these are completely controllable by mankind. Our behavior can control what we do in cyber and what we do in space. It's entirely up to us. Whereas climate and disease are not entirely up to us. Mother Nature has a vote here. So I distinguish those two groupings. And with respect to cyber, cyber itself is not a threat. It's the human actors acting in the cyber domain who are a threat, whether a nation state or individual criminal. Now, unfortunately, until such time as the big three, meaning China, Russia, and the United States, can agree on some cyber norms, and importantly, equally important, a means to enforce those norms, it's going to be the Wild West in cyber for some time to come. I always make the comparison between cyber and the law of the sea, which took decades, hundreds of years to evolve. Now, most seafaring nations abide by the law of the sea because they figured out it was in their best interest to do so. So until such time as we all figure out that it's in our best interests internationally to have cyber norms and enforce them, we're going to be in the situation we are today. This is why it is so important that we grow sufficient generations of cyber specialists who can defend us, defend the government, and defend the private sector. So that's why cyber education is so important. And there's a huge demand out there. I don't know, the estimates I've seen, 2 million people, 2 million positions requiring cybersecurity expertise. So if you're into that, you won't lack for a job. The last two threats I'll mention, the third grouping, is domestic violent extremism. That is a phrase that never was on my radar as recently as 2017 as DNI. Never considered it. We're worried about foreign violent extremism, but not that emanating in the United States by US citizens. And we're kind of in a trick here because we have a lot of laws that allow latitude in pursuing foreign violent extremists, which we don't have in a domestic context. So this is a problem for us. And I'm personally very concerned about it. The last thing I want to mention, which is related to that, is what the RAND Corporation cleverly and aptly calls truth decay, which I think is a great bumper sticker phrase for a serious problem we have in this country, which is agreeing on a basic set of empirical facts. So when people are off in two separate reality bubbles, believing that what they own truth, and we can't agree on what that truth is, that's bad for our democracy or any democracy. The Russians have a very sophisticated understanding of our political landscape and our society. And they know all about the divisiveness and the polarization in this country. And so they exploited that by the use of social media, by representing themselves as somebody else. But that was only one part of it. I mean, they had TV broadcasts on RT, which I have to admit has higher ratings in this country than my network, CNN. More people watch RT than CNN. And so they mounted a very, very skilled, sophisticated campaign. And as I said earlier, they had messages for everybody designed to incite people. For example, they went on a concerted campaign to discourage African Americans from voting, to make the point that it was futile to vote. And these things were very, very sophisticated, very subtle suggestions. Now, we can argue till the cows come home about this, but bear in mind that the difference in vote was less than 80,000 in 3 key states, which the Russians deliberately targeted because they have done the same kind of detailed precinct by precinct analysis that the campaigns do in our country. So they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what the audiences that needed to be targeted.
One of the other themes of your book is what extent are we willing to sacrifice personal liberties for common safety? And you sort of trace that from Fort Hood to the Boston Marathon bombings and even to Edward Snowden. In your opinion, how has the answer to that question, the extent to which we're willing to sacrifice civil liberties for common good, changed since 9/11?
The specific context that prompted that discussion was, of course, the revelations of Snowden about so-called domestic surveillance and the metadata storage program that NSA the National Security Agency, was directed to maintain. A lot of people, when this was revealed, were very offended by it and felt that this was an affront to their civil liberties and privacy. So the philosophical question it raises for me, though, is to what extent are we as individual citizens willing to sacrifice for the common good? So I'd ask all of you, well, do you normally stop at red lights or stop signs? For the young people here, if you go to a bar and you're carded, you produce your ID. Do you go to the when we could fly, do you go to the airport 2 hours early so you can go through TSA? Well, those are all little small examples of things that we give up, we sacrifice in the way of, literally our civil liberties and privacy in the interest of the common good. So, I used to find myself longing for the halcyon days of the Cold War, where we had a clearly identified enemy that we understood, that we knew someday was going to collapse, but we read them, we knew, and all other threats were subsumed by that threat. And importantly, our two telecommunication systems were mutually exclusive. There was one dominated by the Soviet Union and its satellites, and one dominated in the West by the United States. And if you ever saw a reference to US persons in the Soviet-dominated telecommunication system, it was a rare, rare event. That just never happened. Along comes the internet. Now we're all mixed up together. So you have every day hundreds of millions of people conducting billions of innocent transactions, but all mixed up among them are nefarious people doing nefarious things. So the challenge now for the intelligence community, specifically the National Security Agency, is how do you find those nefarious needles, not just in one haystack, but in thousands of haystacks? And oh, by the way, and so you pick out the needles without touching any of the strands of hay. And also, you're supposed to be able to predict when one of those hay strands morphs into a needle. Now, metaphorically speaking, that's what I'm kind of talking about the challenge we have in trying to, ensure the safety and security of the country, and at the same time protecting civil liberties and privacy. It's very difficult. And so how much are citizens willing to, A, understand that, and are willing, just like you are willing to stop at a red light, allow the government to do what it has to do to make sure the country is safe and secure.
And this tension between civil liberties and common safety, another question, and that is, what, in your opinion, is the role of transparency in intelligence collection and in government more generally?
Transparency is great. I love it. And after Snowden, I pushed declassifying a lot of documents, particularly related to what's called the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, in the interest of trying to promote trust and confidence, or restore trust and confidence among the American public. Now, transparency is a two-edged sword, because transparency is great for the American public. So the more you learn about an intelligence community and what it does and why it does it, that's better. But adversaries go to school on that very transparency, as we saw the terrorists when we exposed things, or when Snowden exposed things. They went to school on that. They made changes. They made it harder for us to collect intelligence. So that's the risk versus gain proposition that intelligence officials have to make a judgment on. Do we share that, expose this to the public, hopefully gain their trust and confidence? But when we do that, how much are we compromising? How hard are we going to make it on ourselves if we give up something, because the adversary will change their behavior or hide what we were seeing? So that's the trade-off. I think cyber is another domain. I don't know that it would ever be the exclusive one. I think, you hear these doom and gloom predictions about a cyber Pearl Harbor. Well, the problem with that formulation is that there are basically two nation states that could do that to us. Certainly Russia and probably China, where they could paralyze us you know, take down our power grid, paralyze our financial system, stop all the ATM machines. Yeah, they could do that. But the problem is those are nation state entities that also have vulnerabilities that we can exploit, either cyber or kinetically. And everybody knows that. So the Russians and the Chinese undoubtedly have penetrated us. And they probably have implants all over the place, even in our critical infrastructure.
In 2015, after about 10 years, the U.S. Army stopped its Human Terrain Systems program, where they had the Human Terrain Systems program. For those who may not know, it's where they had scholars and academics in the humanities field, such as anthropology and sociology, take to the field alongside military personnel to get a better understanding of the local population and its cultures and customs, to fill a gap in knowledge. In the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal, cultural concerns and the Americanization of conflict became part of the discourse. And my question is, given that, do you think in the future there may be room for a similar partnership or program within the military or the intelligence community?
If we embark on another, which I hope we don't, nation building campaign in country X, maybe so. Now the Human Terrain program I found was absolutely critical in Afghanistan to have an understanding of the tribal dynamics and the dynamics of a local community, a local village. I mean, the United States is infamous for the ugly American image, and so the Human Terrain program was a part of the effort to overcome that. The problem, I think, is doing it on a 6 or 9 or 12-month deployment and then starting all over with replacements. My major takeaway from Afghanistan, by the way, was a replay of something I experienced in my war, Southeast Asia. That is our failure to gauge will to fight.